most of my work has been looking at African-American communities, especially urban communities. And so I started to think about how cooperative ownership could apply to African-Americans. But when I started asking both co-op people in the US in the 90s and African-Americans, most people couldn't tell me about any African-American co-ops or co-op activity or any history. It made no sense to me. So I started asking more questions and got together with a classmate of mine from grad school who actually had been studying Du Bois's economic thought and realized that there were African Americans thinking about and doing cooperative economics. And it turns out that everywhere I looked in African American history, once I knew what to look for and what kinds of key words to use that weren't necessarily co-op or cooperatives, I found a long and strong history of mutual aid and cooperative ownership. Once again, there were codified laws for cooperative ownership. Again, still the same reason why any group starts a cooperative: market failures, but also for Blacks, a lot of it was because of racial economic discrimination, needing to find alternative economic strategies. It was and has been a hidden history, right? Partly because people were afraid to talk too much about what they were doing because of white supremacist terrorism against alternative economic activities for Blacks, but also partly because people didn't really talk about it as a co-op, right? And so often once you stop asking people about, do you know about co-ops, and just ask about mutual aid or a revolving loan fund or some other kind of solidarity activity, people resonate to that better. And then there also aren't a lot of records. The US actually doesn't have good records about co-ops anyway. And then in Black documentation, I had to really go very slowly and carefully through newspapers, archives of organizations and famous Black people, autobiographies and things like that to really find these. So the book, I cover hundreds of mutual aid societies, Black communal towns, and examples of formal and informal economic cooperation from around 1780s to 2013. I found about 162 legally incorporated cooperative enterprises owned by Blacks, not a huge number, but considering, for the first 5 years, everyone told me there were none. I felt pretty good that I could find 162. And as I said, the legally incorporation only happened from around 1880, the 1880s onward. US didn't have co-op laws before that, right? So that's why it's important to also talk about the mutual aid societies and the communal towns and the other informal economic cooperation. And I also, people keep asking me what industry, what region. I found them all over rural and urban, north, south, Midwest, West, all over the place. Also, Du Bois wrote a book in 1907. He found 154 co-ops, most of them separately from my 162. I think there's only about 10 that overlap, and 20 credit unions. So he also had started looking mostly in the 19th century. And was able to find some. But again, his 1907 study of Black co-ops is like the least known of all his writings. And so again, people didn't follow up with what he did, didn't follow his lead, and thinking this was an important thing to look at, that kind of thing. So one of my favorite examples is 1885, the Knights of Labor, which actually wasn't just a Black labor union. It was integrated at a time when segregation was becoming codified in the South after the Reconstruction. So it was amazing that it was actually an integrated union, but it also was a union that supported women's rights and co-op development and empowered and trained their members on how to create worker co-ops. So it's a really interesting group. It was a large union throughout, I think, the Northeast and the South in the 1880s, right? So the 1880s are also a time very similar to now. It's a increased political repression, right? The Reconstruction was over, so white supremacist terrorism is starting. They're taking away Black voting rights. the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the rise of the Jim Crow laws and apartheid in the US. And yet you have this very, very progressive integrated union that's also talking about co-op development. And one of the examples that I find really fascinating because of how they connected so many issues was the campaign in Richmond, where they wanted to take over city council because they were unhappy with how the old city council was planning to rebuild the city hall with convict labor. And so they won control, right? The blacks and the whites the blacks were still, this was just before the blacks lost the right to vote in Richmond. They had a coordinated campaign, and the Knights of Labor won control of the city council. And then the city council went and hired a racially integrated, unionized local workforce, including women workers, and working through worker cooperatives to rebuild Richmond City Hall, which had been burned down during the Civil War. So really interesting, right, combination of economic, political, labor, women's rights, Black rights, progressive rights, and focused around achieving co-op development. So I wanted to give that example as just sort of a, we don't have as many examples of that kind of integrated activity, but it's really important, and for people to see it can happen even during times like we're in now. Fast forward to the 1930s, which is another era of a lot of Black co-op activity. I actually found 3 periods. So the 1880s also had a lot of Black organizations that were doing co-op development, not just Knights of Labor. The 1930s and 40s had a lot of co-op development in the 1960s and 70s. So the 30s, I have 2 examples. Gary, Indiana, started with a study group coming together. A lot of them were teachers in a Black high school in the Blacks part of Gary. They were talking about disinvestment in their community during the Great Depression and how they lost their steel mills. And the first meeting they had lost their last bank branch, had left their neighborhood. They started meeting weekly for 18 months, talking about what they could do and learning, teaching themselves about cooperatives, because they realized that was probably what they needed to do at this time. They actually developed a night school co-op economics course for everyone to take. And within 3 years, it was the largest enrolled class in their night school. That's the adult education part. They started a women's guild to continue with the study group. They eventually opened a buying club and then turned that into a co-op grocery store. And then a credit union, a co-op gas station, and a second grocery store. Called themselves Consumers Cooperative Trading Company. And one of the things one of the founders said was the most important thing was the education program, that if they hadn't been studying and working together, they would never have been able to put together that whole system of co-ops. He also said that the Women's Guild and the women's persistence also helped. So yeah, I think I said this already. They had their first store by 1935. Remember, this is the height of the Depression, right? In a year, their grocery store was considered the largest African-American grocery store in the United States. And then they also did, as I said, gas station, credit union. They also, as a co-ops give dividends back to their members when they have a profit, or what they call a surplus. And so this grocery store within 2 years was able to give back dividends as well. So some of it is wealth creation, right, as well as other things. Back to Richmond, which has a really interesting co-op history, but in 1938, the Red Circle Cooperative was started, and they actually studied what was happening in Gary, Indiana, and brought the model back to Richmond. They did a membership drive, started with, again, education and monthly meetings. Within a year, or within that first year, they went from 35 initial members to 125, which gave them equity enough to start thinking about opening a grocery store. They went on study tours to see how other people were doing co-op development. And then in Old Jackson Ward in 1938, they had the audacity to open up their co-op grocery store across the street from an AMP grocery chain. And so they were like, the white grocery chain isn't doing it for us. Not only are we going to start our own co-op, but we'll compete directly with them. And they were also mad at the AMP because it didn't hire any Black clerks, and they had been asking for that. They actually competed so well that they ended up doing better. Their store did better than the white grocery chain, which finally did hire a Black, but it was too little too late. And by 1940, they had 40 members, 4 employees in the grocery store, and revenues of, what was that, 7,000 a year, annual revenues of 7,000. Oh, sorry, 700 a week, not annual. They also were able to pay dividends within the second or third year, and were serving over 100,000 people, even though they only had 400 members. They were serving the community as well. So another really interesting example of what co-ops can do and how African Americans have used them. Now I'll fast forward to the 1980s. A group that's still existing, Cooperative Home Care Associates, is actually still the largest worker co-op in the United States. And it's made up mostly of Latina and African American women worker owners, right? This is a really exciting concept for how to increase both the quality of the job of home health care and the quality of home health care to the people who need it, right? And so this co-op started to train low-income, low-skilled women on how to do high-quality home care. They created, they're a for-profit worker-owned company, but they also created a nonprofit subsidiary to do the training, to put their money where their mouth was about high-quality training. But that also meant that they could up the prices so that they could charge living wages, so their member owners could earn living wages. They also joined with the industry, with the visiting nurses and other groups in New York City and New York State to make sure that New York State allocated the maximum amount to home care service so that their prices would be competitive. And so they ended up, even though they were able to raise the wages and stuff in the industry, they also provide above average wages. They also provide benefits, career ladder opportunities in the co-op leadership training. And so they have very low turnover in their co-op. And they were able to take what had been a contingent, very underpaid and non-full-time work. They were able to have most of their worker owners have full-time work, benefited work, and ability to move up to get training in nursing levels, to get training and move into their management positions, or to move into their training positions, so they didn't have to stay in the low-skilled work if they didn't want to. So really interesting, again, a really interesting model of what you can do in an industry that's highly exploitative and highly problematic, and raise the level for a variety of people. And then I'll just end with this year, right? The Drivers Cooperative launched in New York City. Driver-owned hauling cooperative, predominantly people of color. They created their own co-op ride app to rival Uber and Lyft. Their purpose, better pay in the short term, but also they want to transition the industry in the long term to a more platform co-op, democratic ownership kind of model. And so they're able already to allow their drivers to make more money than they would if they worked for Uber and Lyft. They actually their drivers are actually allowed to still work for Uber and Lyft, so they don't require them to just work for them. They let their drivers do what they want, but their purpose is to make sure it's a better fit, and they get better returns than driving for any of the other things. The profits go back to the drivers as dividends, which is part of how co-ops work. There's democratic decision-making for the drivers and much easier to use for the riders, and also riders who want to be in solidarity with the drivers. So this this app that they have would be considered a platform cooperative app, meaning that instead of the app being owned by private a private business or company, the app is owned by the drivers, right, by the workers. And so it's a worker co-op, but it's also what we call a platform cooperative, where you co-op ownership of a platform, of the software, that kind of thing. So the other thing I've also started looking at is the benefits to young people for co-op ownership, and especially Black youth, Black and brown youth. And what I found is I started to study those through history, but also in the 21st century, or late 20th century and 21st century, is the way that getting young people to own their own or to create their own co-ops teaches them business skills and industry-specific skills, but it also helps to reinforce their math and writing skills so they can do better in school, or maybe even stay in school, because they now see why they might need math, that kind of thing. It also, of course, develops leadership. They get mentoring from adults, so there's intergenerational relationships. Just capacity building in general, but also most of these youth co-ops are addressing community problems, just like any co-op does. So the young people are coming together to address a problem and also to make an income by addressing that problem. So it's, again, a really interesting combination. And then they're able to generate income and savings because they're running a co-op, which is, usually it's a successful business that's not only addressing human problems, but bringing in income and savings because they're the profit sharing that they do. So one of my examples is Crenshaw High School in LA in 1992, started in 1992 and lasted about 12 years. The students in that high school actually first did a school farm, and had produce at the end of the summer from a summer program that they did. And first they gave away the produce to the homeless because they were worried about the homeless. Then they learned about farmers markets and started selling their produce through farmers markets. Then one of the teachers gave them a course in business development, and they realized that you can actually, if you add value to produce and manufacture something, you can actually sell it for more and make money. So they actually started a business model to make salad dressing with some of the herbs and things they were growing in their school garden. They decided to call their salad dressing line Food from the Hood. And then they went and started, making the salad dressing, but also marketing the salad dressing so they could sell it. They realized also that it's hard to sell things just locally, right? Just out in front of the school or whatever in their neighborhood. And so this 1992, remember, is early years of Amazon. And Amazon in those days allowed people to sell, I guess they still do, to sell stuff on commission or whatever. So they actually sold their salad dressing for about 8 years or more on Amazon as a way to expand their market share expand their audience, clientele, whatever. They ran this business as a cooperative, as a youth-owned cooperative. They voted that 50% of their profits, their surplus, should be saved for them to have scholarships to college. Over the first 10 years, over $180,000 in college scholarships was awarded to 77 of their managers who graduated. And what that did, right, was also give them a reason to finish high school, right? They now had money to go on to college. And actually the high school put in a college prep program because now they had some students who could seriously think about going on to college. So again, you see all the spillover effects of being engaged in these kinds of cooperatives. So what did we gain? What were Black people gaining? And then I'll give a couple of examples. So the pooling of resources, access to quality goods and services that were especially culturally and geographically sensitive and appropriate, saving costs so they could increase income and wealth, combating racial discrimination, both exclusion and marginalization, especially things like Blacks either not being able to get a mortgage to buy land or to buy equipment, or even often not being able to shop in certain stores, things like that. And so creating their own co-ops and credit unions allowed that. Increasing Black economic stability. So often the fact that a Black community had a co-op or two or three made that community well-being increased more self-sufficiency and independence and more stability because of it. Jobs were saved or created in their communities through the co-ops. This development of collective agency and actions spilled over into leadership development and political action. There's examples of co-ops where people who started out and became leaders in their co-op, then became leaders in other things in their civic society. Then they became leaders statewide and federal political positions. So we can see a lot of this social capital development in addition to these other kinds of economic gains. And that's another thing that's really important that people don't always recognize about cooperatives, is that they're not just a business enterprise model, which can be for-profit or not-for-profit, but they also are a social association, right, model about mutual aid and democracy.